and Julian, she knew, would be consumed by a rage more dangerous than any beast in the desert. He would not just want to bring her back now. He would want to punish her. Meanwhile, a lone rider was following the tracks of the carriage. Silas had not been idle. After watching the carriage disappear, he had sprung into action. He had retrieved a hidden stash of supplies from a secret cache her uncle had created. He had taken his best horse, a tireless Mustang, and he had set off. He was a master tracker, and the carriage left a clear trail. He followed it for 2 days, his face a grim, determined mask. When he saw the tracks turn south away from the main trail, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. He knew where that trail led. Diablo's spine. But he also knew Elara. He had seen the intelligence in her eyes, the steel in her spine. This was not a mistake. It was a plan. He spurred his horse, his worry for her safety, warring with a growing sense of awe at her courage. He followed the tracks into the labyrinthine canyons, and late on the 3rd day he found them. The carriage was abandoned. Julian and his 2 men were gone, presumably having set off on foot in a desperate search for water. And on the ground near a pile of discarded supplies was a small, almost invisible sign scratched into the rock. It was the symbol of the shadowed sun, and it was pointing north. It was a message, a sign of life, a trail for him to follow. A slow, fierce smile spread across Silas's face. She was alive, and she was fighting back. "Hang on, Elara," he whispered to the empty canyon. "I'm coming." Chapter 10. The dust on her hands. Elara survived on pure grit. She walked north, rationing the last few sips of water from the small canteen she had managed to grab. The sun was a merciless hammer, the landscape a blur of red rock and shimmering heat. The skills that Silas had taught her, which had seemed like abstract lessons just a week before, now became the very tools of her survival. She followed the shade moved during the cooler hours of early morning and late evening, and chewed on a piece of leather from her boot to trick her body into thinking it had moisture. By the 2nd day of her trek, she was delirious, stumbling forward on legs that felt like they were made of cotton. The world swam in and out of focus. She thought of her cool green life in Philadelphia, and it seemed like a dream belonging to another person. She thought of her uncle and of the Rourke family, and she found a last tiny reservoir of strength. She was the protector of La Resolana. She would not die here. She was half conscious, leaning against a rock when she heard the sound of a horse. She looked up, her vision blurry, and saw a figure on the horizon riding towards her. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was Julian. She tried to scramble away to hide, but her body wouldn't obey. The rider drew closer, and through the haze of her delirium she recognized the steady, graceful way he sat his horse. The way his shoulders were set with a quiet, unshakable purpose. Silas. She croaked the name, a dry, rasping sound in her throat. He was off his horse in an instant, a canteen in his hand. He knelt beside her, lifting her head gently. "Easy, Elara, just a little at a time." The water was the most glorious thing she had ever tasted. It was life itself. He let her drink a little, then a little more before pulling the canteen away. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, soaked it with water, and gently wiped the grime and dust from her face. His touch was surprisingly gentle. His pale eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw, unshielded concern that made her heart ache. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "I told you I would," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I followed your sign." He helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her and holding her steady as her exhausted body slumped against his chest. The solid, steady beat of his heart against her back was the most reassuring sound in the world. As they rode, he told her what he had found: the abandoned carriage, the tracks of the three men heading deeper into the canyons in a desperate, disorganized flight. "They won't survive in there," he said grimly. "Not without water. The desert will take them." Elara felt no pity. She felt only a vast, overwhelming relief. The wolf was gone, swallowed by the very wilderness he had scorned. They rode back to La Resolana in a comfortable, healing silence. When they finally saw the ranch house in the distance, still standing with only the blackened, smouldering ruins of the barn as a scar on the landscape, Elara felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her. She had fought for this place. She had bled for it, and it was still hers. The weeks that followed were a time of rebuilding both literally and figuratively. With help from Martha and Jedediah from town, who'd been horrified to hear of Julian's attack, they began the arduous task of clearing the debris from the barn. The community, which had once viewed Elara with suspicion, now treated her with a quiet, profound respect. She was no longer the city woman. She was the woman who had faced down a monster and won. She and Silas worked side by side from sunup to sundown. They planned a new, smaller barn. They worked on the fences. They tended the cattle. The drought finally broke in late autumn, a series of gentle, soaking rains that seemed to wash the land clean, turning the dusty plains into a soft carpet of green. The work of the Sombras continued. A new family arrived, and Elara welcomed them not with hesitation, but with an open heart and a steady hand. She was now a true partner to Silas, her knowledge of the world outside the territory proving just as valuable as his knowledge of the trails within it. One evening, as the first chill of winter touched the air, they sat on the porch, watching the stars glitter in the clear, cold sky. The new barn was half built, its frame a dark, promising skeleton against the moonlight. "Do you ever miss it?" Silas asked, his voice quiet. Philadelphia. The lights. The music. Elara thought for a moment. She thought of the tea rooms, the velvet curtains, the suffocating politeness. She thought of Julian's gilded cage. "I miss the books," she said honestly, "and the conversations. But I don't miss the cage." She looked out at the vast silent land stretching out before them, a land that had once terrified her. Now it felt like freedom. "I belong here now." She looked down at her hands resting on her lap. They were not the hands of Elara Vance of Philadelphia. They were strong, capable, and permanently stained with the red dust of the earth. They bore the scars of her work at the forge of her climb through the canyons. They were a map of her new life. Silas followed her gaze. He reached out his calloused fingers, gently covering hers. His touch was warm, solid, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through together. It was a touch that spoke of partnership, of respect, and of a love that had grown as quietly and steadily as a desert plant, tough and resilient, born not of pretty words, but of shared hardship and mutual salvation. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. "My uncle called this place La Resolana," she said softly, her voice filled with a peace she had never known. The sun-drenched place. "I used to think it was a cruel joke, but I was wrong. The sun here, it doesn't just burn, it reveals. It strips away everything that isn't real, everything that isn't true, until all you have left is what you're really made of. She squeezed his hand, her gaze meeting his in the soft moonlight. It took me a long time to realize it. She said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. But there is nothing more real than the feeling of this dust on my hands. Chapter 1. The City of Brotherly Love. The lie tasted of iron and expensive perfume. Elara Vance held the delicate porcelain teacup, its rim painted with forget-me-nots, and smiled at Mrs. Worthington across the polished mahogany table. The smile was a carefully constructed artifice, a mask she had perfected over 24 years in Philadelphia's most respected circles. It was the same smile she used when a gentleman's joke was tasteless, or when a lady's gossip turned cruel. Today, it was a shield. "You are looking a little pale, my dear Mrs. Worthington," observed, her voice a soft coo that barely concealed the probing nature of her gaze. "The wedding preparations, I imagine, so very taxing." "Something like that," Elara murmured, her gaze drifting past the woman's feathered hat to the rain-streaked window of the tea room. Outside, the city bustled under a sky the colour of wet slate. Carriages clattered on cobblestones, their sounds muffled by the thick glass and thicker velvet curtains. It was a world of order, of structure, of suffocating politeness. The truth was, the paleness wasn't from wedding preparations. It was from a terror so profound it had settled deep in her bones, a cold counterpoint to the cloying warmth of the tea room. The wedding, her impending marriage to Julian Croft, was not a source of fatigue. It was the bars of a cage, slowly closing around her. Julian was everything Philadelphia society admired. He was handsome, wealthy, beyond measure, the sole heir to the Croft shipping fortune. His words were as smooth and polished as the marble floors of his family's mansion. When he had first courted her, Elara had been charmed as everyone was. He quoted poetry, brought her imported orchids, and spoke of a future where she would be the queen of his gilded world. But the gilding had begun to flake away, revealing the iron beneath. It started with small things: a casual dismissal of her opinion on literature, a hand on her arm that lingered a moment too long, its grip just a fraction too tight when she tried to pull away. Then came the possessiveness, a chilling certainty in his eyes that she belonged to him as much as his prize-winning horses or his collection of maritime maps. The breaking point had come 2 nights ago. They had been at a ball, and she had spent a few minutes in spirited conversation with a visiting professor from Boston about the burgeoning suffragist movement. Julian had said nothing at the time, his smile a fixed, perfect thing. But in the carriage ride home, the mask had dropped. "You will not make a spectacle of yourself, Elara," he had said, his voice low and devoid of all its usual charm. "Your opinions are for our home, not for public display. You are to be my wife, not a street corner revolutionary." It was a simple conversation. Julian, she had countered, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. It was an embarrassment, he hissed, and his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. The pressure was sharp, deliberate. "Do you understand me? You reflect upon me, and I will not be reflected upon poorly." She had looked into his eyes then, and for the first time she had seen past the handsome suitor to the man beneath, a creature of absolute control, who saw her not as a partner, but as a beautiful prized possession to be managed. The fear had been so sharp, so clarifying, it was like a shard of ice in her chest. She had finally seen the cage for what it was. She had spent the next 36 hours in a state of quiet, cold panic, moving through the motions of her life, while her mind raced, searching for an escape But where could she go? Julian's influence was everywhere. His family was intertwined with every major institution in the city. To defy him publicly would be to invite ruin and scandal not just upon herself, but upon her own family, whose modest wealth was respectable, but no match for the Croft empire. Then yesterday morning the letter had arrived. It was a thin, brittle envelope, postmarked from a place she had only ever seen, on a map Redemption, New Mexico territory. The letter was from a lawyer informing her that her great-uncle, a man she had never met and barely knew existed, had passed away. His name was Alistair Finch, and he had left her everything he owned. His sole possession, the letter stated, was a ranch named La Resolana, the sun-drenched place. The name was a spark in the suffocating greyness of her life. New Mexico. It sounded like another planet, a place of dust and heat and raw, untamed space. A place where Julian Croft's influence could not reach. Sitting in the tea room listening to Mrs. Worthington drone on about floral arrangements, Elara made her decision. It wasn't a choice, really. It was an instinct, the desperate flight of a cornered animal. That night, she packed a single sturdy trunk. She took the warmest clothes she owned, which were woefully inadequate city coats and woolen skirts. She took her books, Dickens, Austen, the Brontes, because the thought of facing the unknown without them was unbearable. And she took the small inheritance her grandmother had left her, a modest sum of cash she had kept hidden for a rainy day. The rain, it seemed, had become a deluge. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to her parents, a vague and loving note about needing time to think about visiting a friend in the country. It was a weak lie, but it would buy her time. The second was to Julian. It was short, stark, and utterly final. Mr. Croft, I cannot be the wife you expect. I will not be the woman you demand. Our engagement is ended. Do not look for me. Elara Vance. She left it on the polished hall table of her family's home, a silent grenade in the heart of their quiet, ordered world. Then, before the sun rose, before the city stirred from its slumber, she slipped out the back door and made her way to the train station. She bought a one-way ticket west, a journey that would take her across a continent, and she prayed into a different life. The scream of the train whistle as it pulled out of Philadelphia was the sound of a lock breaking. It was the most terrifying, most liberating sound she had ever heard. Chapter 2. The Colour of Dust. The world outside the train window bled from green to gold, then to 1,000 shades of ochre and rust. The manicured fields of Pennsylvania gave way to the rolling plains of the Midwest, and then slowly, inexorably, the land began to open up, to stretch and flatten, under a sky so vast it seemed to press down on the very soul. For 6 days, Elara lived in the rhythmic clatter of the rails. She ate dry biscuits, read her books, until her eyes ached and spoke to no one. She was a ghost, suspended between a past she had fled and a future she could not begin to imagine. The other passengers, rough-looking men with calloused hands and weary families heading west, gave her a wide berth. Her fine wool coat and the haunted, closed-off look in her eyes marked her as an outsider, a creature from another world. The final leg of the journey was on a smaller, more rugged line that snaked its way into the New Mexico territory. The air that came through the open window was different now. It was thin and dry, carrying the scent of dust, and something else, a clean herbal aroma like sage and sun-baked earth. The landscape was brutal and beautiful, a panorama of flat-topped mesas jagged rock formations, and endless shimmering plains dotted with hardy scrub brush. The town of Redemption was not a town so much as a suggestion. It was a single, wide, dusty street lined with a dozen or so buildings, their wooden facades bleached and warped by the relentless sun. There was a saloon with swinging doors, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a sheriff's office with a faded star painted on the window, and a handful of other nondescript structures. It was a place that felt temporary, as if the vast, empty land around it might decide to swallow it whole at any moment. Stepping off the train was like stepping into an oven. The heat was a physical presence, a dry, suffocating force that stole the breath from her lungs. The dust of fine red powder coated everything instantly, her shoes, the hem of her dress, the inside of her throat. She stood on the splintered wooden platform, her single trunk beside her, feeling as conspicuous as a canary in a coal mine. A man in a sweat-stained hat, who was loading crates onto a nearby wagon, paused and looked her over. His gaze was not unkind, but it was deeply curious. "You looking for someone, ma'am?" He asked, his voice a slow, sun-cured drawl. Yes, Elara said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy in the immense silence. "I am looking for La Resolana, the ranch of Alistair Finch." The man's expression shifted subtly. The curiosity was still there, but it was now overlaid with a hint of pity. Finch's place. "You must be the niece from back east." News, it seemed, travelled faster than the train in Redemption. "I am. Elara Vance. He's out at the ranch," the man said, gesturing vaguely toward the vast, empty plains to the west. "Silas, Finch's foreman. He'll be in for supplies later. You can wait at the general store. Martha will see to you." He pointed a calloused thumb toward a building with a large faded sign that read, "Redemption Mercantile." Elara thanked him, her voice barely a whisper, and dragged her heavy trunk across the dusty street. The inside of the general store was a dim, cool cavern after the blinding glare outside. It smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried herbs. A woman with kind, tired eyes and hair the colour of corn silk wiped down the long wooden counter. This, presumably, was Martha. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked. "I am Elara Vance. I was told I could wait here for—" Silas Martha's smile was genuine. "Of course. We heard you were coming. It's a tragedy about your uncle. Alistair was a good man, quiet but good." She poured a dipper of water into a tin cup and pushed it across the counter. "Here. You look like you could use this." The water was cool and tasted of minerals. Elara drank it gratefully. For the next 2 hours she sat on a wooden crate in the corner of the store, trying to be invisible, listening to the quiet commerce of the town. Men came in for tobacco or sacks of flour, their conversations clipped and practical, mostly about the lack of rain. It hadn't rained, she gathered in, over 4 months. The word drought was a constant grim refrain. Just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long dramatic shadows across the street, the door creaked open. The man who entered was tall, but it was the silence of his presence that struck her first. He moved with a coiled, quiet grace, his boots making almost no sound on the floorboards. He was dressed in dusty, worn denim and a chambray shirt faded to the colour of the sky. His face was lean and angular, tanned to a deep bronze by the sun, and his eyes, when they briefly flicked in her direction, were a startling pale grey, the colour of a storm cloud. He looked at her for only a second, but in that second, she felt thoroughly assessed and dismissed. Silas Martha said warmly, "Got your list right here. And this is Miss Vance, Alistair's niece." The man Silas turned his head slowly. His pale eyes settled on her again, lingering this time. There was no welcome in them, only a deep, unyielding suspicion. "Ma'am," he said. The word was flat, a stone, dropping into a well. "Mr. Silas." Elara began rising to her feet and trying to inject a note of authority into her voice. "I am Elara Vance. I believe you are the foreman of La Resolana." "I am," he said. He did not offer his last name. He turned back to Martha, picking up a heavy sack of flour as if she no longer existed. A hot flush of indignation pricked Elara's skin. This was her property now. This man was her employee. She was used to deference to a certain level of respect, however feigned. This man's blunt dismissal was as foreign and unsettling as the landscape itself. She weighted her back ramrod straight as he loaded his supplies onto a buckboard wagon outside. When he was finished, he came back to the doorway and paused, his gaze fixed on her trunk. "You comin'?" he asked, as if the question were an inconvenience. Without a word, Elara walked out into the cooling air. He lifted her trunk onto the back of the wagon with an ease that spoke of immense practical strength, then climbed onto the driver's seat. He didn't offer her a hand up. She gathered her skirts, gritted her teeth, and hauled herself onto the hard wooden seat beside him. The journey to the ranch was made in silence. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and purple, a spectacle of such raw, untamed beauty that it brought tears to her eyes. The man beside her seemed not to notice. His attention was on the pair of sturdy mules and the dusty track ahead. As darkness fell, a full moon rose, bathing the landscape in a stark silvery light. The silence pressed in on Elara, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft snort of the mules. She felt a profound and terrifying loneliness, a sense that she had travelled not just across a country, but out of the known world entirely. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pointed. La Resolana. Ahead, nestled at the base of a low mesa, was a long, low adobe house. It was not the grand ranch house she might have pictured. It was a simple, stark structure that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. A few corrals, a barn, and a windmill stood nearby, dark shapes against the moonlit sky. There were no lights in the windows. The place looked deserted, asleep. As they pulled up to the house, Elara noticed a strange symbol no bigger than her hand carved into the main wooden post of the porch. It was a stylized sun, but with a shadow falling across one half of it. It looked ancient, deliberate. Silas brought the wagon to a halt. He jumped down and began unhitching the mules, his movements economical and efficient. He made no move to help her with her trunk or show her inside. "The house is open," he said, his back to her. "Your uncle's room is at the east end, mine's in the bunkhouse." And with that, he led the mules toward the barn, leaving her alone in the moonlight, with her trunk in front of a dark, silent house that was now supposedly her home. She stood there for a long moment, the cool desert air raising goosebumps on her arms. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her situation washed over her. She had fled a gilded cage in Philadelphia, only to find herself marooned in an empty, dusty wasteland with a hostile foreman and a house full of a dead man's ghosts. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Elara Vance walked up the steps of the porch, her hand brushing against the strange carved symbol. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the darkness, the smell of old dust and forgotten lives rising to meet her. Chapter 3. The Weight of Silence. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of abandonment. It was a mixture of cold adobe crumbling paper and the faint lingering aroma of sage and tobacco. Elara fumbled in her reticule for the matches she'd had the foresight to buy from Martha. The first one scraped and died. The second caught its tiny flame a brave defiance against the oppressive dark. She found a kerosene lamp on a small table in what appeared to be a main living area. As she lit the wick, a soft golden glow spread outwards, revealing the room in hesitant increments. It was a space of stark simplicity. The furniture was handmade and sturdy, a rough-hewn table, a few simple chairs, a large stone hearth where the ashes lay cold. A single bookshelf stood against one wall, sparsely populated with volumes on agriculture and animal husbandry. But what dominated the room were the woven blankets draped over the chairs and hanging on the walls. Their colours were rich and earthy, their patterns geometric and complex. They were beautiful, the only spots of vibrant life in the otherwise austere room. She found her great-uncle's room at the end of a short hallway. It was as Spartan as the rest of the house. A simple bed with a patched quilt, a washstand with a chipped ceramic basin, and a small, scarred wooden desk. On the desk sat a single leather-bound journal closed. A thick layer of dust covered everything, a testament to how long the room had been empty. It was clear Alistair Finch had not died here. There was one other door in the hallway. Elara tried the handle. It was locked. She frowned, a prickle of curiosity piercing through her exhaustion. What would a man who lived so simply feel the need to lock away? Too tired to ponder it further, she returned to the main room, dragged her trunk inside and collapsed into one of the chairs, pulling a colourful blanket around her shoulders. She didn't have the energy to make up a bed or even find her nightgown. She simply sat there in the humming silence of the desert night, the lamplight casting her long, lonely shadow on the wall, and eventually she slept. She awoke to the jarring sound of an axe splitting wood. The sun was not yet up, but a pale pearlescent light was seeping through the uncurtained windows. Elara sat up, her body stiff and aching from sleeping in the chair. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the journey, the dust and the silent foreman came rushing back. She went to the window and looked out. Silas was by the woodpile, his back to her. He swung the axe with a fluid, powerful rhythm, each stroke precise and effective. Even from a distance, she could see the lean, hard muscle in his arms and shoulders. He was a part of this landscape, as tough and unforgiving as the earth he stood on. An idea began to form in her mind, born of a long-ingrained habit of command and a desperate need to assert some control over her new chaotic reality. She was the owner of this ranch. He was the foreman. It was time they had a formal understanding. She washed her face in the cold, hard water from the pump outside, pinned her hair into a semblance of order, and put on her plainest, most practical dress. It was still a city dress, hopelessly out of place, but it was the best she could do. She found coffee beans and a grinder in a small pantry, and by the time Silas came in from his morning chores, she had a pot of coffee brewing over a newly lit fire in the hearth. The smell, at least, was a familiar comfort. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. He held his hat in his hands, his hair damp with sweat. "I made coffee," she said, her voice firmer than it had been the day before. "Please sit down. We need to talk." He hesitated for a moment, his pale eyes flicking from her to the fire, then back again. Finally, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he walked to the table and sat. She poured the coffee into 2 tin mugs and placed one in front of him before taking the seat opposite. "Mr. Silas," she began, folding her hands on the table. "As you know, I have inherited La Resolana. This is my home now, and I intend to stay. That makes me your employer." He took a slow sip of the coffee, his gaze never leaving her face. He said nothing. "I would like to see the ranch's ledgers." She continued pressing on despite his unnerving silence. "I need to understand the financial situation, the livestock counts, the outstanding debts and credits. I also want a full tour of the property. I need to know the extent of what I now own." He set his mug down with a soft click. "There ain't much to see, ma'am. I will be the judge of that," she replied, her tone sharp. A long, tense silence stretched between them. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant caw of a raven. "The ledgers are in the desk in your uncle's room," he said finally. "But they won't tell you the important things." "And what are the important things they won't tell you? The south well is about to run dry," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They won't tell you we've lost 10 head of cattle to thirst in the last 2 months. They won't tell you the only reason this ranch is still standing is because your uncle knew how to read the land and because he commanded respect from the other ranchers. Respect you don't have." Each word was a small, hard stone, and Elara felt the sting of everyone. "And they certainly won't tell you that a woman from Philadelphia in a fancy dress has no more business running a ranch in this territory than a coyote has in a church." The raw, unvarnished truth of his words hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was right, of course. She knew nothing. She had spent her life debating poetry and navigating social hierarchies, not reading the land or commanding the respect of hard men. But she would not let him see her falter. "Then it seems you will have to teach me," she said, her chin lifting in defiance. "That is after all part of a foreman's duties, to execute the will of the owner. And it is my will to learn." For the first time, something flickered in his pale eyes. It wasn't admiration, not yet, but it was a sliver of something other than contempt, perhaps surprise. He picked up his mug again, his gaze dropping to the dark liquid within. "The tour starts after breakfast," he said, and it felt like a concession, a small but significant victory. The tour was a sobering education in the harsh realities of her inheritance. La Resolana was vast, its acreage stretching further than the eye could see, but it was a wounded land. The grass was brown and brittle. The creek beds were cracked earth. Silas showed her the south well, and she could see for herself that the water level was dangerously low. He pointed out the fences that needed mending, the section of the barn roof that had been damaged in a windstorm and never repaired. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were dense with information. He explained the rotation of grazing pastures, the signs of sickness in cattle, the way the position of the sun on the mesa could tell you the time of day. He was a walking encyclopedia of this place, his knowledge as deep and ingrained as the lines on his face. Elara listened, trying to absorb everything, her city-soft brain struggling to keep up. She asked questions, and to his credit, he answered them without condescension, his tone purely factual. As they rode, she found herself watching him, the way he sat his horse, with an easy, natural grace, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading a language she couldn't begin to comprehend. They stopped at the highest point of the property, a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the entire ranch. The sun beat down, and Elara felt a trickle of sweat run down her back. "Why did he call it La Resolana?" she asked, shielding her eyes with her hand. "The sun-drenched place. It feels more like the sun-scorched place." Silas was silent for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the parched landscape. Because he saw what it could be, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He used to say the sun gives life, but it also demands respect. It can burn you to a cinder if you don't know how to live with it." He turned in his saddle to look at her, his pale eyes seeming to see right through her defences. He loved this land, Miss Vance, more than anything. It broke his heart to see it thirsty. In that moment, she saw a flash of the man behind the stoic foreman, a man capable of loyalty, of a deep and abiding connection to her uncle and to this place. It made him more formidable and strangely more human. "I want to see the locked room," she said, changing the subject abruptly. His face hardened again, the brief moment of connection gone. "That's your uncle's study. It's his private space. It is my house now. I want to see inside." "I don't have the key," he said flatly. She knew he was lying. The certainty of it was absolute. But she also knew that pushing him on it now would be a mistake. It was another locked door, another secret in a place that seemed to be made of them. They rode back to the ranch house in a renewed tense silence. That evening, Elara sat at her uncle's desk and opened the ledgers. Silas was right. They were a grim testament to the ranch's decline. Page after page of expenses with dwindling income. She saw payments for feed they could no longer grow themselves, notations of livestock lost. But she also noticed something strange. Every few months there was a significant cash withdrawal listed simply as provisions. The amounts were far too large for simple supplies. What had her uncle been spending this money on? It was another piece of a puzzle she didn't understand. She closed the ledger, the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. She was in debt, in a drought on a failing ranch, with a foreman who tolerated her at best. Any rational person would sell the property for whatever they could get and take the next train back east. But the thought of Julian's face, of his cold, controlling eyes, was a far greater terror than any drought or debt. And there was something else, too. A stubborn, unfamiliar feeling was taking root in her heart. A desire not just to survive this place, but to understand it. To understand the quiet man who had loved it, and the other quiet man who was now its fierce, solitary guardian. She looked at the locked study door. Whatever was in there, whatever Alistair Finch had hidden away, she felt with a growing certainty that it held the key not just to the ranch's secrets, but to her own future. Chapter 4. The Language of Work. The days that followed fell into a grueling, monotonous rhythm. Elara quickly learned that her previous life had prepared her for absolutely nothing of value in the New Mexico territory. Her fine motor skills, honed by years of embroidery and piano playing, were useless when faced with a broken fence post. Her knowledge of French poetry could not coax a single drop of extra water from a dying well. She insisted on working. It was the only way she reasoned to earn a sliver of Silas's respect, and more importantly, to feel like she wasn't just a useless ornament in her own home. She rose before the sun, her body protesting with a chorus of new and inventive aches. She started with the chickens, a task Silas deemed simple enough not to be dangerous. She collected the eggs, filled their water trough, and scattered their feed, trying to ignore the way they pecked at the hem of her worn-out city dress. From there, she graduated to mending. She sat for hours under the shade of the porch, her hands once soft and pale, growing clumsy and raw as she learned to patch canvas feed bags and stitch tiers in leather harnesses. Her neat, perfect stitches from her embroidery days were replaced by thick, functional seams that were ugly but strong. Silas watched her. He never offered praise, but he stopped making dismissive comments. He would walk by his gaze, flicking over her work, and occasionally offer a clipped piece of advice. Pull that thread tighter, it'll snap in the sun otherwise. Or use the awl to start the hole, you'll split the leather. She took his advice without argument, a silent acknowledgement of his superior knowledge. A fragile, unspoken truce began to form between them, built not on words, but on the shared language of work. One sweltering afternoon, she found him by the south well, staring down into its depths with a grim expression. The creaking of the windmill above was a slow, mournful sound. "It's worse, isn't it?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He nodded, not looking at her. "The pump's pulling up more sand than water. Another week, maybe 2, and she'll be dry." "What will we do?" The question was quiet, stripped of her earlier defiance. It was a genuine plea for an answer she didn't have. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant heat-shimmered horizon. "There's another well, up in the north pasture. Deeper, more reliable." "Then why aren't we using it? Pump's broken. Piston rod snapped in a dust storm last year." "Your uncle, he didn't have the funds to get the part from Santa Fe. And we didn't have the means to fix it ourselves. What would it take to fix it?" He finally turned to look at her, a wry, almost bitter smile touching his lips. "A miracle, Mom, or a blacksmith with the skill of a watchmaker and the patience of a saint. The blacksmith in Redemption, Jedediah. He's good with horseshoes and branding irons. This is fine work. Forging a new rod, fitting it just so. It's beyond him." He paused. "Your uncle and I, we tried. Spent a week at the forge. Came close, but close ain't good enough. A millimetre off and the whole thing seizes up." A familiar stubbornness sparked in Elara. "I want to see it." He seemed about to argue, then apparently thought better of it. He simply nodded and led the way to the small dusty forge near the barn. The broken piston rod lay on a workbench, a thick piece of iron snapped cleanly in 2. Beside it were several failed attempts at a replacement lumps of twisted, misshapen metal. Elara picked up one of the failed pieces. It was heavy solid. She ran her fingers over the clumsy weld, the uneven shape. She knew nothing of blacksmithing, but she knew precision. She had spent a lifetime with things that required it. In Philadelphia, she said softly, more to herself than to him, "My father's closest friend was a horologist, a master clockmaker. I used to spend hours in his workshop watching him work. He would forge tiny gears, springs no bigger than a thumbnail. He always said the secret wasn't strength, but heat and patience. Controlling the temperature to the precise degree." Silas looked at her, his brow furrowed. "This ain't a clock, ma'am." "No," she agreed, setting the metal down. "But the principle is the same. It's about understanding the properties of the metal, when to heat it, when to cool it, when to strike." A reckless idea born of desperation took hold. We're going to try again." He stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Yes. You have the strength and the knowledge of the forge. I have an eye for detail, and I am a fast learner. We have nothing to lose, Silas." She saw a war of emotions in his face, skepticism, weariness, and a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of intrigue. The idea was absurd. A city woman in a forge. But the alternative was to sit and watch the ranch die. "The fire will be hot enough to melt the nails out of your shoes," he warned. "I'll wear my sturdiest boots," she replied, her voice steady. And so began the most unlikely of partnerships. The forge, which had been silent for months, roared back to life. The first few days were a disaster. Elara learned that the heat was more intense than she could have ever imagined, a living, breathing monster that sapped her strength and left her gasping for air. The smoke stung her eyes. The clang of the hammer on the anvil rattled her teeth, and the sheer physical effort of working the bellows left her arms feeling like lead. Silas was a harsh, demanding teacher. He showed her how to read the color of the heated metal from dull red to bright cherry, to a searing white-hot yellow. He taught her the difference between a heavy shaping blow and a light tapping one. He didn't coddle her. When she made a mistake letting the metal cool too quickly and become brittle, he simply grunted again. But she did not give up. She tied her hair back, wrapped her face in a damp cloth against the smoke, and worked until her hands were a mass of blisters and soot. She learned to anticipate his movements, to have the next tool ready to work the bellows with a steady, even rhythm that kept the fire at the perfect temperature. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to make progress. Her meticulous eye, trained by years of fine, detailed work, proved to be an asset. She could spot a flaw in the metal, a slight unevenness that he focused on the raw strength of the task might have missed. One evening, after a long, frustrating day, they finally had a piece that looked promising. It was straight, the weld nearly seamless. They were both filthy, exhausted, and streaked with sweat and soot. They stood side by side, staring at the cooling piston rod on the anvil. It might hold, Silas said, his voice a low rasp. It was the closest he had come to praise. Elara felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost made her dizzy. She looked at her hands. They were black with soot, the nails broken, the palms covered in blisters. They were by Philadelphia standards ruined. But looking at them, she felt a satisfaction she had never known. These were the hands of someone who did something, who made something. For the first time, she felt like she might actually belong to this place. "Let's see if it fits," she said. They carried the new rod to the north well as the stars began to appear in the deep purple sky. Working by the light of a lantern, Silas expertly began to reassemble the pump mechanism. Elara held the lantern steady, her heart hammering in her chest. It was a moment of truth. He slid the new piston rod into place. It went in smoothly without resistance. He connected it to the pump handle, his movements sure and practiced. He took a deep breath, looked at her for a moment, his pale eyes catching the lantern light, and then he began to pump. The handle moved up and down stiffly at first, then with more ease. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of creaking metal. Then came a gurgle, a deep, promising sound from the belly of the earth. And then a stream of water, clear, cool, and abundant, gushed from the spout, splashing onto the thirsty ground. Elara let out a gasp, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Silas stopped pumping and just stood there watching the water flow, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He turned to her, and in the flickering lantern light, she saw him smile. It was not the bitter wry twist of his lips she had seen before. It was a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face, erasing years of hardship and suspicion. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, shaking his head in wonder. "You did it, ma'am. You actually did it." And in that moment, standing in the cool desert night, covered in soot and grime, listening to the life-giving sound of water, Elara Vance felt a profound shift inside her. The fear that had driven her from Philadelphia was still there, a shadow in the back of her mind. But it was no longer the only thing she felt. Now there was something else, a fierce, wild hope. And for the first time, she wasn't just running from something. She was starting to build something. Chapter 5. The Uncle's Ghost. The restoration of the North Well marked a turning point. It did not solve all their problems. The drought persisted, and the ranch's finances were still precarious. But it was a tangible victory, a symbol of their nascent partnership. The water was a lifeline, and the act of creating it together had forged a new kind of respect between Elara and Silas. He began to talk more. Not much, but the oppressive silence that had once defined their interactions was replaced by a shared comfortable quiet. He would point out a hawk circling high overhead and name it. He would explain the medicinal properties of a desert plant she had previously dismissed as a weed. He started calling her Elara, the formal ma'am, disappearing from his vocabulary. In return, she found herself opening up to him in small ways. She told him about the books she loved, about the city she had left behind, not the gilded cage part, but the concerts, the libraries, the intellectual fervour. He would listen, his head tilted, a curious expression on his face, as if she were describing a foreign country, which in a way she was. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky bleed into sunset, she finally broached the subject that had been nagging at her. "Silas," she began, her voice casual, "tell me about my uncle." He stiffened slightly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What do you want to know? Everything. I never met him. To me, he's just a name on a piece of paper." "What was he like?" Silas was silent for a long time, gathering his thoughts. "He was quiet," he said finally. "Like this land. Didn't waste words. But when he spoke, you listened. He came out here 30 years ago, bought this land when it was nothing but rock and scrub. Built this house with his own 2 hands. Why did he never marry, never have a family? He did love someone once." Silas said, his voice low. "A woman from back east." He never said her name, but he said she chose a different life, a softer one. I think he never got over it. He poured all the love he had into this place instead. The words resonated with a painful familiarity. A man who loved a woman who chose another life. It was a story she knew, but from a different perspective. He was a good man. Silas continued, his voice rough with emotion. Fair. Honest. He'd give you the shirt off his back if you were in need. The people in this territory, the ones who are often forgotten. They knew they had a friend in Alistair Finch. What people Elara asked, sensing there was more to his words. He seemed to catch himself, his guard going up again. Just folks, drifters, families down on their luck. He stood up abruptly. "I've got to check on the new calf. He was hiding something." The same way he was hiding the key to the study. It was connected to the large unexplained cash withdrawals in the ledgers, she was sure of it. Her uncle, the quiet recluse, had been leading a life far more complex than that of a simple rancher. Her determination to get into that locked room intensified. It was no longer just about curiosity. It was about understanding the man whose legacy she had inherited and the secrets that Silas was so determined to protect. The opportunity came a few days later. A neighboring rancher, a man named Henderson, rode over to ask for Silas's help with a difficult birth. One of his prize mares was in trouble. Silas agreed without hesitation, telling Elara he might be gone all night. As she watched him ride off into the dusk, a sense of guilt warred with her resolve. She was about to betray his trust, the fragile bond they had built over the heat of the forge. But the need to know was stronger. Once he was gone, she began her search. She started in his small room in the bunkhouse, a place she had never entered before. It was as sparse and clean as the man himself. A narrow cot, a single wooden chest for his clothes, and a small wobbly table. There were no personal effects, no clues. She returned to the main house, her frustration mounting. She searched her uncle's room again, running her hands along the wooden frame of the desk, tapping on the floorboards, looking for a loose stone in the hearth. Nothing. Finally defeated, she sat at the desk, her head in her hands. Her fingers idly traced the scarred surface of the wood. She felt a small, almost imperceptible notch on the underside of the desktop right in the center. Her heart quickened. She felt around it. It was a small, cleverly hidden wooden button. She pressed it. With a soft click, a false panel at the back of the deep bottom drawer sprang open, and inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, was a single heavy, ornate iron key. Her hands trembled as she took it. It felt ancient, significant. She walked to the locked study door, the key feeling cold and heavy in her palm. She slid it into the lock. It turned smoothly, the sound of the tumblers falling into place, echoing in the silent house. She pushed the door open and held her lamp aloft. The room was not what she expected. It was not a simple office. It was a library, a sanctuary. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled not with books on farming, but with poetry, philosophy, history, and classical literature. It was the library of a deeply educated, thoughtful man. In the center of the room was a large, flat desk. But it wasn't a writing desk. The entire surface was covered with an enormous hand-drawn map of the New Mexico territory. It was incredibly detailed, far more so than any printed map she had ever seen. It showed not just towns and rivers, but hidden springs, secret canyons, and faint, unmarked trails. And scattered across the map were dozens of small, carved wooden markers. Each marker was in the shape of the symbol from the porch post, a sun with a shadow across it. Her gaze fell upon the journal sitting open on a small lectern in the corner. It was the same one she had seen on his desk, but this was a different one, a working journal. The page was open to an entry dated just a few weeks before his death. Her hands shook as she read her uncle's elegant looping script. October 12th. The Rourke family arrived last night. 2 children, mother weak with fever. They fled the rail camps near Silver Creek. The company bosses run those places like slave plantations. Gave them water and food. Silas will guide them north to the canyon hideout at first light. The Sombras will be safe there for a time. The last withdrawal has nearly depleted our funds. But what is money when weighed against a human life? Julian's letter arrived today. He mentions Elara, my sister's granddaughter. He speaks of her with a chilling possessiveness. I fear for the girl. I have written to my lawyer. If something should happen to me, La Resolana must go to her. This place. It must be a sanctuary. It must remain a refuge for the shadows. Elara sank into the chair, the lamp nearly slipping from her grasp. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, breathtaking clarity. La Resolana was not just a ranch. It was a station on a modern-day underground railroad. The provisions were funds to help people. The folks down on their luck were fugitives. The sombras, the shadows, were the people her uncle and Silas were hiding, sheltering from injustice. And the locked room was the nerve center of the entire operation. And the man she was fleeing, Julian Croft, had been in contact with her uncle. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice-cold fear through her. How deep did his web of influence run? She looked around the room, seeing it with new eyes. This was her uncle's ghost, not a spectre in the hallways, but a legacy of quiet, dangerous courage. A legacy of providing sanctuary to those who lived in the shadows. A legacy that by inheriting this ranch had just become hers. And Silas was not just her foreman. He was her partner in a secret war she had just discovered she was a part of. He wasn't protecting the ranch's secrets from her. He was protecting her from them, testing her, waiting to see if she was worthy of the truth. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Elara's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. She wasn't alone. She grabbed the heaviest book she could find, a thick volume of Plato's Republic, and flattened herself against the wall beside the door, her breath held tight in her chest. The study door swung open slowly. A tall figure was silhouetted in the doorway, holding a lantern. It was Silas. His face was grim, his eyes hard as flint. He had come back early, and he had caught her. Chapter 6. A Partnership of Shadows. The silence in the study was absolute, a living thing that pressed in on them from all sides. Silas stood in the doorway, his lantern held high, its light carving his face into sharp angles and deep shadows. His gaze wasn't angry. It was something far more profound, a deep, weary disappointment. He looked from the open journal to the map on the desk, and then finally to Elara, who stood frozen against the wall, the heavy book still clutched in her hands like a pathetic weapon. "You should not have done this," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the voice of a man whose trust had been shattered. Elara's fear slowly gave way to a surge of defiance fueled by the revelations in her uncle's journal. She lowered the book and stepped out from the shadows, meeting his gaze squarely. "You left me no choice, Silas," she countered, her voice trembling but firm. "You kept me in the dark. This is my home, my legacy. I had a right to know the truth. A right." He took a step into the room, his presence seeming to shrink the space. "The right to put people's lives in danger. The right to undo 30 years of your uncle's work because of simple curiosity." "This was not simple curiosity," she retorted, gesturing wildly at the map at the journal. "This is about families fleeing slavery in the rail camps. It's about a man, my uncle, who turned his home into a sanctuary, and it's about you, his partner, who judged me unworthy of knowing any of it." Her words hung in the air between them. He stared at her, and she could see the internal struggle in his pale eyes. The duty to protect the secret warring with the raw truth of her accusation. Alistair made me promise, he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it. He said if anything happened to him and you came, I was to watch you, to test you, to see if you had any of his sister's steel in your spine, or if you were just another fragile flower from the east. He said the truth of this place could get you killed, and he wouldn't have that on his conscience. And what was your verdict? She demanded. Was I failing the test? I didn't know, he admitted, running a hand through his dusty hair in a gesture of profound weariness. I saw a woman who knew nothing of this life, who was afraid of the sun and the silence. Then I saw a woman who was willing to get blisters on her hands to bring water to a dying ranch. I saw you stand up to me. I saw you learn. I was going to tell you when the time was right. The time is right now, she said softly. She stepped closer to the desk, her fingers tracing the outline of the territory on the map. Tell me about the Sombras. He hesitated for a moment longer, then let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of surrender. He walked to the desk, placed his lantern beside hers, and the room was filled with a bright, steady light. The shadows, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. That's what your uncle called them. The people who fall through the cracks. Mostly families from the mining and rail camps. Some are natives fleeing the reservations. Some are just folks who crossed the wrong man, a man with money and power. They have nowhere to go. The law in this territory, it often serves the highest bidder. Alistair believed everyone deserved a chance at a life free from a master's whip or a company boss's fist. He pointed to the map. La Resolana is the first stop, the way station. From here we guide them north through a series of hidden canyons and old shepherd's trails to safer territories in Colorado or Utah, where they can disappear and start new lives. The carved suns are trail markers, signs of a safe path or a hidden spring. And the money, Elara asked. The withdrawals from the ledger. It takes money to make people disappear, Silas said grimly. Bribes for a ferryman who won't ask questions. Food and supplies for a journey that can take weeks. Medicine. Sometimes a horse and wagon. Your uncle poured every cent he ever made from this ranch back into the Sombras. That's why the place is falling apart. He chose people over profit. Every time. Elara felt a wave of awe and a deep aching sadness for the man she had never known. He had been a quiet king in a forgotten kingdom, his noble work hidden from the world. And Julian Croft, she asked, her voice a near whisper. My uncle's journal mentioned him. He knew Julian. Silas's face darkened. Croft's shipping company has a stake in the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. He came out here last year supposedly to inspect their operations. He and your uncle met at a territorial dinner. Alistair, he didn't like him. He said Croft had the eyes of a wolf, and that he spoke of you like you were a deed he already owned. Alistair wrote you into his will the next day. The fear returned sharp and cold. Julian's reach was longer, more insidious than she had imagined. He wasn't just a jilted suitor. His business interests were tied to the very system that created the fugitives her uncle was saving. He knows I'm here, Silas. She said the words catching in her throat. I sent him a letter before I left. He's not a man who accepts being told no. He will come for me. Silas looked at her, and for the first time she saw not suspicion or disappointment in his eyes, but a fierce protective fire. Then we'll be ready for him. The use of the word we was a quiet declaration. The test was over. The truce was over. They were partners now, bound by a dead man's legacy and a looming shared threat. The Rourke family, Elara said, remembering the journal entry. "Are they still in the canyon?" He nodded. "They should be. It's a 3-day ride from here. I was planning to take them a new supply of dried meat and flour next week." "We'll go together," she said. "It wasn't a question. I need to see it. I need to understand what it is we're fighting for." He studied her face in the lamplight, and then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Elara. We go together. At dawn, day after tomorrow." In the 2 days that followed, the atmosphere at La Resolana was transformed. An energy, a sense of shared purpose, replaced the tension that had once filled the air. They worked together to prepare for the journey, packing supplies, checking the horses' shoes, filling canteens. Elara felt a strange lightness, a sense of clarity. The fear of Julian was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer a paralyzing terror. It was a whetstone against which she could sharpen her resolve. She finally had a purpose that was larger than her own survival. She was no longer just the owner of a dusty plot of land. She was the custodian of a sanctuary. On the morning of their departure, she stood on the porch as Silas saddled the horses. She was dressed in a pair of sturdy denim trousers and a simple shirt she had found in her uncle's study, things he must have kept for the fugitives. The clothes were worn and too large, but they were practical, and for the first time she felt appropriately dressed for the world she now inhabited. As she was about to step off the porch, her eyes fell upon her hands. They were no longer the pale, delicate hands of a Philadelphia lady. They were tanned by the sun, the skin toughened, the palms calloused. There was a healing blister on her thumb from the forge and a fresh scratch on her knuckle from packing the supplies, and they were coated in a fine layer of the same red dust that covered everything. She looked at them, and for a moment she saw the ghost of the woman she used to be, a woman who would have been horrified by such a sight. But Elara Vance was not that woman anymore. She looked at the dust on her hands and she smiled. It was no longer the colour of decay or hardship. It was the colour of work, of purpose, of life. It was the colour of home. "Ready?" Silas asked, leading the horses forward. "Ready," she replied, her voice clear and strong. And together they rode out from La Resolana, two partners heading north into the vast silent landscape to meet the shadows. Chapter 7. The Canyon of Whispers. The journey north was an immersion into a world of stark, brutal beauty. They rode through landscapes that shifted from rolling grassy plains to winding arroyos carved by flash floods that had occurred centuries ago. The sun was a relentless adversary, and the silence was a constant companion, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the horses' hooves and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Elara, who had once considered a walk through a city park to be a significant outdoor excursion, found a surprising resilience within herself. The initial soreness of being in the saddle for hours on end gave way to a steady endurance. She learned to conserve her water, to read the subtle changes in the terrain, to trust the instincts of her horse. Silas rode beside her, a silent and watchful guide. He pointed out landmarks, a lone twisted juniper tree, a strangely shaped rock formation that were markers on the invisible trail her uncle had mapped. He taught her how to find north, using the sun and shadows, how to identify the tracks of a coyote versus those of a mountain lion. He was peeling back the layers of the landscape, revealing the secret life that pulsed just beneath its harsh exterior. On the second night, they made camp in a small protected cove at the base of a towering red rock cliff. The fire crackled, a small bubble of warmth and light in the immense star-dusted darkness. "He taught you all this, didn't he?" Elara asked, staring into the flames. "My uncle." Silas nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "When I first came to this territory, I was 17, an orphan running from a life I didn't want. I was half-starved and full of anger. Alistair found me trying to steal one of his chickens." Elara looked at him surprised. "He didn't turn me over to the sheriff." Silas continued, a faint smile on his lips. "He brought me inside, gave me a hot meal, and offered me a job. He taught me how to work the ranch. But he taught me more than that. He taught me how to read, how to write. He gave me the books you saw in his study. He said a man's mind was like the land, it would turn to dust if you didn't cultivate it." His voice grew thick. "He was more of a father to me than the one I was born with. Everything I am, I owe to him." Elara finally understood the depth of his loyalty, the reason for his fierce protection of her uncle's legacy. It wasn't just a job. It was a sacred debt. The next day they entered the canyons. The trail became narrow and treacherous, winding through a maze of towering rock walls. It was cooler here, the sun only reaching the canyon floor for a few hours at midday. The air echoed with a strange whispering sound as the wind moved through the narrow passages. Late in the afternoon, Silas held up a hand, bringing them to a halt. He dismounted and pointed to a rock wall that looked to Elara exactly like all the others. "We're here." He walked to the wall and pushed against a large flat slab of rock that was cleverly disguised as part of the cliff face. With a low grinding sound, it swung inwards, revealing a dark opening. "An old Anasazi passage," Silas explained. "Alistair found it years ago. He lit a lantern and led the way inside. The passage was narrow and cool, smelling of damp earth. After a few hundred feet, it opened up into a hidden box canyon, a secret world concealed within the larger one. It was a small green oasis. A thin trickle of water, a seep spring, ran down one of the rock faces, nurturing a patch of grass and a few hardy cottonwood trees. A small permanent camp was set up, a few sturdy tents, a fire pit, and some pens for goats. A man with a rifle emerged from one of the tents, his face tense, but he relaxed when he saw Silas. A woman and 2 small children peeked out from behind him. This was the Rourke family. The woman, whose name was Mary, rushed forward when she saw them, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Silas. We were getting low on flour, thank God." Her gaze fell on Elara, and a flicker of fear crossed her face. "Who's this?" "This is Elara Vance," Silas said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Alistair's niece. She's the new protector of La Resolana. She's a friend." The weight of that title, protector, settled on Elara's shoulders. She looked at the family, at the raw hope and deep-seated fear in their eyes, and she knew she would do whatever it took to be worthy of it. She spent the afternoon with Mary, helping her grind corn and tend to the children, one of whom was still weak with a lingering cough. Mary told her their story, a harrowing tale of brutal working conditions, cruel foremen, and the constant threat of violence in the rail camps. They had fled in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. "Your Uncle Mary," said, her eyes welling with tears, "he was a saint. He gave us a chance. He gave our children a future." As darkness fell, they sat around the fire, sharing the fresh food they had brought. It was a strange and powerful communion. Here in this hidden canyon, they were not a ranch owner, a foreman, and a family of fugitives. They were simply people bound together by a shared struggle for survival and a sliver of hope. Later that night, as the Rorks slept, Elara and Silas stood by the entrance to the canyon, looking out at the sliver of star-filled sky visible above. "This is what he was protecting," Elara said softly. "It's not just about land and water. It's about this. Human decency." "He believed it was the only thing that mattered," Silas replied. "What happens now?" she asked. "What happens to the Rorks? In a few weeks, when the moon is new, I'll guide them further north. There's a community of homesteaders in southern Colorado who will take them in. Then, we wait for the next ones." A cold reality settled over Elara. This work was endless, dangerous, and now it was hers. And the threat of Julian was no longer just a personal one. If he came, if he discovered what they were doing, he wouldn't just destroy her. He would destroy this entire network of hope. He would crush the Sombras. "We have to be smarter," she said, her mind racing the old strategic part of her brain, the part that navigated the complex social chess games of Philadelphia, kicking into gear. "We can't just react. We need a plan. When Julian comes, he won't be alone. He'll have money, and he'll hire men who aren't afraid to be brutal." Silas looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. He was seeing the city woman now not as a liability, but as a potential asset. Her mind, her education, they could be weapons just as valuable as his strength or his knowledge of the land. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said, her gaze hardening, "that the best way to fight a wolf is not to meet him with brute force in the open, but to lead him into a trap he doesn't see until it's too late." They left the canyon at dawn, leaving the Rourke family with enough supplies to last them for weeks. The ride back to La Resolana was different. A new intensity, a new focus defined their silence. They were no longer just a ranch owner and a foreman. They were strategists. They were soldiers in a quiet war. When they were a day's ride from the ranch, they saw it. A thin pillar of smoke rising into the clear blue sky from the direction of their home. It was not the gentle wisp of a chimney. It was the thick black angry smoke of something burning that should not be. No, Elara whispered, a cold dread seizing her heart. Silas said nothing. He simply spurred his horse into a gallop, his face a grim, stony mask. Elara followed her mind, filled with a single terrifying thought. The wolf had come early. Chapter 8. The Ashes of a Home. They rode with a desperate, reckless speed, the horse's hooves pounding a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The column of smoke grew thicker, blacker, a foul stain against the pristine blue of the desert sky. The smell reached them next, the acrid stench of burning wood, and something else, something sickeningly final. They crested the last rise, and Elara's heart stopped. It was the barn. The great sturdy barn that had stood for 30 years was an inferno, a roaring pyre of orange and black. Flames licked at the sky, and the roof had already collapsed inwards, sending a shower of sparks into the air. But it was the sight in front of the ranch house that turned her blood to ice. A fine, expensive carriage, a jarringly out-of-place symbol of Eastern wealth, stood near the porch. And standing beside it, watching the fire, with a look of calm, proprietary satisfaction, was Julian Croft. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored travelling coat, not a speck of dust on him. He looked as if he had just stepped out of a Philadelphia drawing room. 2 other men were with him, rough, hard-faced men with pistols holstered at their hips. They were a stark, brutal contrast to Julian's polished elegance. As Elara and Silas galloped into the yard, Julian turned, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Elara, my dear." He called out, his voice carrying easily in the dry air. "I see you've been enjoying the rustic charms of the countryside. I do hope I haven't arrived at an inconvenient time." Silas brought his horse to a skidding halt, his hand instinctively going to the rifle sheathed in his saddle. One of Julian's hired guns immediately drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked a sharp, deadly sound. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, cowboy," the man snarled. "Silas, don't," Elara said, her voice shaking. She swung down from her horse, forcing her legs to hold her steady, and walked toward Julian, her heart pounding a wild, terrified tattoo against her ribs. She stopped 10 feet from him. "What are you doing here, Julian?" she demanded, her voice cold as ice. "A better question, my love, is, what are you doing here?" he replied, his tone one of mock concern. "Living in this hovel, consorting with this." He flicked a dismissive glance at Silas. "I was worried about you, so I came to bring you home." "This is my home," she shot back, "and I am not going anywhere with you." Julian's smile tightened, the charm in his eyes replaced by the cold, flat light of possession she remembered so well. "Oh, I think you are. You see, this little adventure of yours is over. It was amusing for a time, a quaint little rebellion. But it ends now. You will come back to Philadelphia with me. We will be married as planned, and we will forget this unfortunate episode ever happened. And if I refuse..." He gestured languidly toward the burning barn. "Then things will continue to be unpleasant. Your home, this ranch, it seems to be quite flammable. A terrible shame. It would be a pity if the house were to catch fire next." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. He would burn everything to the ground to get what he wanted. "You are a monster." She whispered the words filled with a loathing so pure it was almost a physical force. "I am a man who takes what is his," he corrected her smoothly. He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to her clothes, her dusty face, her ruined hands. A look of distaste crossed his features. "Look at what this place has done to you. I will have you clean again. I will have you back in silk and pearls where you belong." Behind him, Silas sat frozen on his horse, his face a mask of controlled fury, his knuckles white where he gripped the reins. He was trapped, outnumbered and outgunned. Elara's mind raced, scrambling for a way out for the trap she had spoken of, but had not had time to build. She looked at Julian's arrogant, confident face, at his hired thugs, at the ashes of her barn, and she knew that direct confrontation was suicide. She needed to buy time. She needed to play the game she knew best. She let her shoulders slump, the defiance draining from her face. She allowed a single tear to trace a path through the grime on her cheek. She looked at him, her expression one of utter defeat. "All right, Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You win. You've won. Just, please don't hurt anyone else. I'll come with you." A look of pure, unadulterated triumph lit up Julian's face. He had won. The possession was secure. "Excellent decision, my dear. I knew you would see reason." Silas made a low, guttural sound of protest from behind her. "No, Silas," Elara said, turning to look at him, her eyes pleading. But beneath the fear, she hoped he could see something else. A flicker of a message. A silent command. "Wait. Trust me." His eyes narrowed, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would charge anyway. But then he seemed to understand. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, his hand slowly moving away from his rifle. "Pack your things." Elara Julian commanded, his tone once again that of a master to a servant. "Just the essentials. I will not have this provincial filth cluttering up my carriage." Elara turned and walked toward the house, her steps slow and deliberate. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to remain calm. As she stepped onto the porch, she paused, her hand resting on the carved symbol of the shadowed sun. She had a plan. A desperate, half-formed, incredibly dangerous plan. She entered the house and went straight to the study. She didn't pack her clothes. She went to her uncle's desk and took out the detailed map of the territory. She also took a small, sharp letter opener. Then she went to the kitchen and found a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. She was no longer just Elara Vance, the city lady. She was Alistair Finch's niece, the protector of La Resolana. When she emerged from the house 10 minutes later, she carried a small satchel. Her face was a mask of docile resignation. "I'm ready," she said. Julian smiled, offering her his arm. The touch of his hand on hers felt like a brand. "Excellent. We can be back in civilization in a week." He led her to the carriage. One of his men held the door open. As she was about to step inside, she turned back to Silas, who still sat on his horse, a solitary, defeated figure. "I'm sorry, Silas," she said, her voice carrying. "I'm sorry for everything." Then she climbed into the carriage, the door shutting behind her with a solid, final thud. Julian climbed in after her, and the carriage lurched forward, leaving Silas, the ranch house, and the smouldering ruins of the barn behind. As they rode away, Elara stared out the window, her gaze fixed on Silas, until he was just a small dot on the horizon. She clutched the satchel in her lap, her knuckles white. The first part of her plan was complete. She was inside the wolf's den. Now she just had to find a way to burn it down from the inside. Inside the carriage, Julian relaxed against the plush velvet seat, a self-satisfied smile on his lips. "You see, my dear, this is where you belong. Comfort, elegance, not dust." Elara did not answer. She simply stared out the window at the passing desert, her mind a whirlwind of calculations, her heart a cold, hard stone of resolve. The journey was just beginning. Chapter 9. The Trail of a Lie. For 2 days, Elara played the part of the broken woman. She was quiet, submissive, her eyes downcast. She answered Julian's questions with monosyllabic replies, and allowed him to hold her hand, though the touch made her skin crawl. He preened under her apparent capitulation, his ego swelling with every mile they travelled east. He spoke at length about their future, about the party she would host, the dresses she would wear, the perfect ornamental life he had designed for her. She listened, and she learned. She learned their route. They were taking the main trail back towards Santa Fe to meet the train. She learned that his 2 hired men, a brutish pair named Cobb and Miller, were motivated by nothing more than money. And she learned that Julian's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He believed so completely in his own superiority that he never once suspected her compliance was a charade. On the second night, they made camp near a small, muddy watering hole. While Cobb and Miller tended to the horses and built a fire, Julian set up a small, elegant tent for her. "A little touch of civilization for you, my love," he said, as if bestowing a great gift. After a tense, silent meal, Elara retired to the tent, claiming exhaustion. Julian, satisfied with her docility, went to share a bottle of expensive whiskey with his men by the fire. This was her chance. Working by the faint moonlight that filtered through the canvas, she took the map from her satchel. Using the piece of charcoal, she carefully altered it. She knew from her brief study in her uncle's library that there was a notoriously difficult and confusing maze of canyons and dry washes to the south of their current trail, a place known to locals as Diablo's Spine. Travelers who strayed into it often became hopelessly lost. With deft strokes, she erased a section of the main trail on the map and redrew it, making it look as if it veered directly south into the heart of the spine. She added landmarks she had invented: a whispering arch, a Three Sisters rock formation, to make the false trail seem legitimate. She was using Julian's own ignorance of the territory against him. The next morning she put the second part of her plan into action. As they were preparing to leave, she accidentally dropped her satchel near the fire. Miller, the more observant of the two thugs, picked it up. "What's this?" he grunted, pulling out the altered map. Julian strode over. "What is it?" "Give it here." He snatched the map and unrolled it. He frowned. "This is a detailed map of the territory." "Where did you get this, Elara?" She looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "It was my uncle's. I thought it might be useful." Julian studied the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Interesting. According to this, there's a significant shortcut. It cuts south here. It could save us a full day's travel." He was hooked. The prospect of returning to civilization a day earlier appealed to his inherent impatience. "I don't know," Boss Cobb grumbled, peering over his shoulder. "That looks like rough country." "Nonsense." Julian scoffed his arrogance, taking the bait completely. "The map is clear. It's a direct route. We're taking the shortcut." He didn't ask for an opinion. He stated a fact. Miller and Cobb, paid to follow orders, not to think, shrugged and began to prepare the horses. Elara felt a small, cold thrill of success. The trap was set. They turned south an hour later. The terrain changed almost immediately. The trail became rocky, the landscape more rugged and confusing. By midday they were deep within a winding canyon, the high rock walls disorienting them. "I don't like this," Miller said, his horse stumbling on a loose rock. "We haven't seen this whispering arch your map talked about." "We'll find it," Julian insisted, though a hint of doubt was beginning to creep into his voice. He consulted the map again, his confident expression faltering. They pressed on. The sun beat down, and their water supplies began to run low far more quickly than they had anticipated. The canyon walls all looked the same, and every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the maze. By late afternoon, even Julian could no longer deny the truth. "This map is wrong," he snarled, throwing it to the ground in a fit of rage. "We're lost." Panic began to set in among the men. They argued, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. This was the moment Elara had been waiting for. In the midst of the chaos, while Julian was berating Cobb for not bringing enough water, she slid the small, sharp letter opener from the sleeve of her dress. With a quick, silent movement, she darted to the back of the carriage and slashed the leather straps holding one of the spare water barrels in place. The barrel crashed to the rocky ground and split open, its precious contents sinking instantly into the thirsty earth. Cobb spun around. What the it must have been frayed. Elara cried, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of distress. The rocks must have cut it. The loss of the water sent the men into a full-blown panic. Their discipline crumbled, replaced by a primal fear of thirst. The arguments escalated, turning ugly. "This is your fault," Cobb yelled, jabbing a finger at Julian. "Your shortcut. You were supposed to secure the supplies." Julian shot back, his polished veneer completely gone, replaced by a raw, snarling fear. As they screamed at each other, Elara backed away, slowly melting into the shadows of the canyon wall. She had created chaos. She had sown discord. Now she would disappear. She scrambled up a rocky incline, her hands and knees scraped raw, her lungs burning. She didn't look back. She could hear their shouts fade in behind her as she navigated the treacherous terrain using the skills Silas had taught her. She followed the sun, heading steadily north back towards the main trail. She traveled for hours, driven by adrenaline and a desperate will to survive. As night fell, she found a small hidden cave to shelter in, and she finally allowed herself to collapse, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. She had done it. She had escaped. But she was alone in the middle of a hostile wilderness with no food and very little water.